Chapter 2.1 Workshop Harmonic Motives. In this video, I'll demonstrate a process for composing harmonic motives based on images generated from AI. I'll present 3 different images, each generated from a prompt. And in the 2.1 exercise assignments, you'll find several additional images to use as inspiration for your own motives. Here is the first image. The prompt is a lone knight looking upon a vast wilderness with mountains in the background. The first thing that I'll do is to make a few observations about the image. The word knight, to me at least, implies a heroic, honorable character, so the musical language should imply that. The light breaking through the clouds in the distance also implies hope. But the mountains, as well as how far away the knight is from that light, implies a difficult journey ahead. So it should be noted that my interpretation may be different than yours, and that's totally fine for any of these images. You may see things that I don't see, and those observations may translate into some type of musical element. In this image, the tall mountains have me thinking of a large ascending leap, possibly a leap of an octave or more. And one potential method for coming up with a harmonic motive is to actually first come up with a melodic interval. I'll somewhat arbitrarily choose an octave for my interval. Major ninths and above actually work well too. Another idea that crossed my mind was root motion by thirds in the bass. Composers like Wagner or Bruckner, film composers like Howard Shore, used chromatic mediant progressions when composing heroic music. Connecting adjacent major triads through root motion by thirds, either major or minor thirds, usually results in this type of sound. Here's just an example of the type of harmonic progression that I'm referring to. The chromatic voice leading between chords is encouraged, especially in the bass and top voice. I think having an ascending top voice, either by chromatic step or short leap, and a bass line that moves by short or even large leap works really well. But I also have the idea of the large ascending melodic leap by an octave. Either way, the ascending motion will hopefully create an uplifting feeling that would fit the theme of the image. So, a few other musical elements that might be helpful to establish. I think a slow tempo would be best. I'm hearing the overall register of notes to be placed somewhat in the middle part of the register or even towards the bottom, but at the same time rising into the treble register. And I think a common meter like 4/4 or 3/4 or even something in 6 would be best. Odd meters like 5 or 7 tend to work better when there's more uncertainty and tension, in my opinion, although if the tempo is slow enough, 5/4 would probably work just fine. Okay, so the next step might be to come up with some type of harmonization for this interval, or whatever interval you initially chose. This method starts with a melody note and adds harmony, but of course you could start with the harmony and then voice the chords to form a top melodic line. Either can be effective, and I'll demonstrate both in this video. I'll choose mostly major thirds for this motive. If the C is the root of a C major triad, the second chord could be an A flat major triad. That's root motion by a major third. Or the initial C could be the major third scale degree of an A flat major chord. You could reverse the progression, and the second chord could, of course, be a C major triad, or it could be an F major triad. That's root motion by a minor third. I also sometimes like to have the ascending melodic note coincide with a suspended harmony, as shown now, where the C in the second chord is the raised fourth of a G flat major triad. This suspended note will often then resolve down by step to the major third of the chord. Or you could start with an F major triad and move to the A flat major triad, another root motion by third. Now you could of course choose to harmonize the C with another chord. The C doesn't necessarily need to be one of the triadic chord tones, but for this particular image, I'm drawn to simple harmonies. with chromaticism found in the motion between chords rather than within them. As soon as I find a potential harmonization that I like, I can compose a few measures of music using some of the elements that I've discussed thus far: major triads, a slow tempo, middle to low register positioning of chord tones, and root motion by thirds. My first attempt here features alternating long and short chords. The longer chords on the downbeats move by root motion of a third. The passing chords on beat 4 connect to those downbeat chords through stepwise motion. And while I mostly wanted major triads, the first passing chord is a minor triad. But because it's in second inversion, the extent to which we hear this as a minor chord is slightly diminished. And in the second passing chord, I'm featuring that G flat major triad, so there's a bit of chromaticism here, as the initial G natural in measure 1 is then G flat in measure 2. One last thing here, to enrich the harmony slightly, you can always look for common tones between adjacent chords. Of course, the note C is common to the majority of these, and I could have the C suspended through the G flat chord as well, that raised fourth. But in this moment, I could also suspend the E flat from the previous A flat major triad. I'll resolve this note upwards to the F in the final measure. So, taking a step back, I have a 3 measure motive that is mostly harmonic and melodic in nature. From here, I could orchestrate this idea, develop it, expand it. We'll discuss expanding and developing this type of idea in Chapter 2.4. For now, we're focusing on short ideas only. And before moving on to the second image, here are 2 different harmonic motives that I came up with for the same image of the lone knight. The first one features chromatic harmonic motion once again, this time semitone bass motion between the first 3 chords, then tritone motion in measure 2. To enrich the harmony slightly, the second chord also features the major 7th scale degree. This ends up sounding quite different from my first version, mostly because of this semitone chromatic motion. And finally, the final version features an ascending melodic line from a low register to just above middle C. The harmony once again features root motion by thirds. However, I'm using more chord inversions to help establish a rising bass line as well. Okay, so moving on to the second image, also an image generated by AI. This time the prompt was a private detective at a 1930s speakeasy. The idea here was the film noir aesthetic. It's difficult to get AI to do exactly what you want. This image was actually the 3rd or 4th attempt after some tweaking of the prompt. Regardless, you can get a sense for the time and place and perhaps the mood. The first thing that I hear in my mind is the harmony, specifically these 2 types of extended tertian chords, the minor triad with the major 7th and major 9th, as well as just a regular minor 9 chord. There's something about that major 7th and 9th that works so well here, in part because we've heard that chord so often, whether it was from a James Bond score or some film noir movie, or of course from Bernard Herrmann. Another chord progression that I think fits this aesthetic is to use the dominant chord with the sharp 9. That can lead back into the minor tonic chord. And in general, I think using a lot of suspended, extended tones can work really well in this context. If you recall from Unit 1 of the course, when it comes to composing chord progressions with extended pitch collections, like this minor triad with major 7th and major 9th, it can be interesting to connect multiple chords in succession that feature the same chord class, but with different roots. So for instance, here I'm moving sequentially between 3 key areas, all connected by root motion of a third. Each chord features some of those suspended extended tones, including the major 7th and major 9th. It can be a great tactic for avoiding a static tonal center in your motive or thematic material. With that in mind, here's my first attempt. It features what I would call sequential motion from a G minor key area to an E flat minor key area, then up a semitone to E minor. This motive obviously has both a harmonic and melodic component. Of course, we haven't discussed melodic motives yet in the course, so I won't fixate on that for now. That's coming up in the next chapter. Pay attention to the voice leading between chords, the relatively low chord tone positioning, and the chord spacing in general. Now, here's one more version that I came up with. This is more rhythmic in nature. I was hearing some of that James Bond music, particularly in the way in which the bass lines occasionally serve as pedal tones and how they often enter a beat before the treble foreground motion. This version also features sequential motion by a descending third, which will disrupt the initial key area. Notice too how short this motive is. If you can make something identifiable in just a measure or two, often there are a lot of interesting ways in which then you can repeat the idea and develop it over time. All right, I'll finish this brief video with one more example. I won't go into as much detail with the process for this one. I will, however, include it or an image very close to it in the exercise assignments for the week. The prompt is an evil wizard in a dark forest, so quite ominous and eerie. In terms of musical ideas, I could see this going one of two ways. The far easier method for coming up with a harmonic motive would be to take inspiration from John Williams, using root motion by a third, or by linking chords that don't share any common tones and that aren't diatonically related. For example, this progression of 4 chords. Just like Williams did in that Emperor Palpatine motive that we studied in Unit 1, and use a lot of chromatic melodic motion, some small leaps, but mostly stepwise motion in both the top voice and in the bass voice. So that's one method. The more difficult method, in my opinion, compositionally, is to use clusters of chromatic collections. For example, using a collection of more than 8 or 9 unique pitches, as demonstrated here. Now, at very soft dynamics, when voiced across a wide register, you can achieve some really ominous sounds. Normally, I avoid spacing chord tones so closely together at the bottom of the bass clef staff, but I'm not worried about chord clarity at all here. The darker, the better. But still, I'm using some wider chord tone gaps as I get lower in pitch. But all of these pitches voiced in this chord belong to this initial collection. This isn't all that effective in a single piano, but it can be extremely effective when orchestrated properly. Let's hear it first in piano. And for a change, here's that exact same chord with a simple synthesizer patch. Now, this harmonic motive can work really well as a potential background for some sort of melodic component. Again, we'll talk more about melodic motives in 2.2. As mentioned in the exercise assignments for this week, you'll find several different images, and I want you to compose short harmonic motives that you feel fit that image well. Feel free to compose for piano, as I've mostly done in this video, or if you feel comfortable orchestrating your ideas, that can add a whole other component to this process.